They were gods among mortals. Divine blood ran through their veins, or so they claimed. From the shadowed temples of Karnak to the sun-baked sands of the Valley of the Kings, Egypt's royal dynasties sculpted their names into stone, worshipped not merely as kings, but as living deities. But beneath the gilded masks and monuments, there lurked a secret, one not carved into tombs or spoken aloud under the stars. A secret written in chromosomes. Centuries of brother marrying sister, father wedding daughter, and cousin binding with cousin, all in the desperate pursuit of purity. Created not a dynasty of gods, but a lineage twisted by genetic affliction, deformities, disease, madness. This is the story of Egypt's most revered rulers, and their most damning legacy. This is not just the tale of inbreeding. It is the story of empire, of pride, of power so blinding it ignored the fundamental laws of nature. Prepare to journey into the heart of a royal disaster, where divine ambition met genetic ruin. This is Egypt's hereditary curse. To understand Egypt's genetic catastrophe, we must first understand its spiritual obsession with bloodlines. Ancient Egyptians didn't see their pharaohs as mere rulers. They were the physical embodiment of gods on earth. The king wasn't just chosen by the gods, he was one. This divine concept wasn't metaphorical. From the earliest dynasties, pharaohs claimed to descend from deities like Ra, Horus, and later Amun. But claiming divinity wasn't enough. It had to be preserved. That meant ensuring that royal blood remained pure, untarnished by the common people. And so, Egypt's elite began to turn inward, quite literally. Marriage became a sacred tool. Royal siblings wed each other in imitation of Isis and Osiris, the divine couple and siblings, in an effort to preserve the bloodline and prevent foreign contamination. Even daughters were married to their own fathers, not for love, but for legitimacy. This pattern began as early as the Third Dynasty and only intensified with time. The famous 18th Dynasty, Egypt's Golden Age, was particularly notorious for its tightly interwoven family trees. Thutmose IV married his own sister. His grandson, Amenhotep II, likely did the same. This wasn't scandalous. It was expected. The line of Amun, after all, had to remain untainted. But such divine ambition had consequences. Genetic isolation is a slow, creeping curse. Recessive diseases begin to emerge. Deformities that once appeared rarely begin to appear more often, passed silently from parent to child. And because these marriages were so closely contained, there was no genetic escape hatch, no fresh blood to dilute the damage. Yet the belief in divine blood was stronger than science, stronger than reason, and certainly stronger than biology. They didn't know DNA, but they knew something was wrong. Still, the theology was inflexible. The gods had chosen the bloodline, even if the blood itself was beginning to rebel. A prince with a club foot was still a son of Ra. A queen with 6 toes still bore the lineage of Osiris. And a king with no heirs? That was the gods' will, or perhaps their silent punishment. It's important to remember that these choices weren't made out of ignorance, but out of spiritual conviction. They believed the cosmic balance, Ma'at, demanded purity, harmony, and order. Even if nature screamed otherwise. Visual, broken statues lying in the desert sand. Thunder cracks. Thus begins the dark paradox. The Egyptians sought immortality through blood, and sowed the seeds of their dynasty's undoing. Coming up in Section 2, we turn our eyes to one of the most infamous figures in history, Tutankhamun. Not merely the boy king, but the genetic end product of centuries of royal inbreeding. What really killed him? Disease? An accident? Or his own DNA? He ruled for just under a decade, died before his 20th birthday, left no heirs, and yet his is the most famous name in ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun, the boy king, buried in splendor, surrounded by golden artifacts meant to ferry him to eternity. But behind the glitter lies a truth far less glorious. Tutankhamun was a genetic victim of his dynasty's obsession with purity. In 2010, a landmark genetic study conducted by Zahi Hawass and a team of Egyptian scientists turned the world's attention from Tutankhamun's tomb to his genome. Using DNA from 11 royal mummies, they reconstructed a lineage of unprecedented intimacy. Tutankhamun was not just the son of a pharaoh, he was the son of a brother-sister union. His mother, not Nefertiti as once believed, but a full sister of Akhenaten, whose name remains unknown, but whose DNA was confirmed. Tutankhamun wasn't just royalty, he was royalty condensed. And the result? Catastrophic. He was born with a cleft palate, a club foot, possibly a curved spine. Evidence suggests he walked with a cane. In fact, over 130 canes were buried with him. Some were clearly used. He had necrosis in his toes and likely suffered from Köhler disease, a condition causing bone degeneration in the foot. This was not a healthy young man cut down in his prime by a tragic accident. This was a chronically ill boy, the biological product of an inbreeding system nearing collapse. He died at 18 or 19. Theories once ranged from murder to malaria to chariot accident. But the genetic evidence points to something simpler and sadder. A weakened immune system, compounded by congenital defects, which made even a minor injury or infection potentially fatal. Tutankhamun had no surviving children. 2 mummified fetuses found in his tomb, likely his stillborn daughters, bear witness to the cost of his lineage's genetic fragility. The dynasty had run out of steam, out of genes, out of time. This was not merely the tragedy of a boy king, it was the unraveling of a god-king lineage brought low by its own sacred obsession. Tutankhamun's short life, so richly mythologized, is in fact a cautionary tale, not just for dynastic inbreeding, but for the dangers of theological rigidity. His family believed themselves to be divine, but divinity, when too closely guarded, can become a prison. When bloodlines circle in on themselves too tightly, they don't preserve gods. They manufacture ghosts. The end of Tutankhamun's reign marked more than just the death of a young ruler. It was the symbolic end of Egypt's experiment with hyper-royal inbreeding. The throne would eventually pass to military men and outsiders, ending the old bloodline. But the damage had been done. As we move forward, we'll uncover even deeper layers of this dynastic disaster. In Section 3, we examine the 18th dynasty at large, the era that birthed Tutankhamun, and how the most celebrated figures in Egyptian history may have carried the same hereditary burdens, masked by grandeur and gilded walls. They reigned at the height of Egypt's power. They built colossal temples, expanded the empire's borders, and amassed treasures beyond imagination. The 18th dynasty, golden, divine, and unchallenged, stood as the zenith of Egypt's greatness. But beneath the shining monuments of Thebes and the towering obelisks of Karnak lay the seeds of a biological unraveling. The gods' chosen family was unraveling from within. The 18th dynasty began with Ahmose I, who expelled the Hyksos and united Egypt in triumph. But it was under rulers like Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and Amenhotep III that Egypt transformed into a superpower, religiously radiant, culturally rich, militarily mighty. But their obsession with dynastic purity was absolute. Marriages between royal siblings weren't merely tolerated, they were the norm. Pharaohs married half-sisters, full sisters, and sometimes even their own daughters. Why? Because the throne was not merely political. it was cosmic. To wed outside the royal line was to dilute the blood of the gods. Better to fold the family tree inward than to branch outward to lesser nobility. And so, the family tightened. But each generation brought increased risk. Genetic diversity narrowed. Mutations, once isolated, became fixed. Let's consider Amenhotep III, the dazzling Sun King. His reign lasted nearly 40 years and is considered a time of prosperity. But behind the scenes, his marriages echoed the divine incest traditions. He married Tiye, a commoner of exceptional status, but he also took his daughters as secondary wives. His son, Akhenaten, married Nefertiti, who may have been a cousin or even closer relative. Akhenaten, known for his revolutionary religious reforms, has long puzzled historians and physicians alike. Ancient carvings show Akhenaten with a strangely feminized physique. His limbs are spindly, his skull elongated, his abdomen swollen. Was this artistic symbolism or a physical reality? Some researchers believe Akhenaten may have suffered from Marfan's syndrome or another genetic disorder. Others point to Freilich syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, or even familial gynecomastia, all of which could result from concentrated recessive genes. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear. Akhenaten's body was not that of a typical warrior king, and neither was his son's. Akhenaten passed his blood, and possibly his afflictions, to Tutankhamun. But the dysfunction didn't begin with them. Even Hatshepsut, the great female pharaoh, was the daughter of Thutmose I and his full sister. She married her half-brother, Thutmose II. Their daughter, Neferure, was groomed as both priestess and heir, and may have even married her own uncle. The patterns are undeniable. The most powerful figures in Egypt's most illustrious dynasty were genetically entangled, locked in a loop of inherited risk. Yet their grandeur concealed their suffering. No inscriptions mention deformities. No papyrus laments the cost of purity. The priests wrote of order, legacy, eternity, not disease, weakness, or defect. Narrator. They believed they were maintaining divine order, but in truth, they were waging a slow, invisible war against nature itself. And the gods, it seems, were losing. The 18th dynasty's end was abrupt. Tutankhamun left no heir. His successors, Ai and Horemheb, were not of royal blood. They were generals, advisors, opportunists. The bloodline had withered, and with it, so too did Egypt's golden age. But the dynasty's genetic decline was not just a historical curiosity. It was a living experiment, a record of what happens when ideology overrides biology. They sought to make their blood eternal. Instead, they made it fatal. In Section 4, we'll travel even further back, into the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, to examine whether Egypt's inbreeding obsession was born with the 18th dynasty, or whether the roots were always there, buried deep in the sands of the Nile. Long before Tutankhamun, before Akhenaten, before the grand temples of Karnak, Egypt's royal bloodlines were already being bound, not by politics, but by theology. To find the genesis of dynastic inbreeding, we must descend far deeper into history, to the Old Kingdom, the age of the pyramid builders. The Old Kingdom, spanning roughly 2700 to 2200 BCE, was the era of Egypt's first divine kings. Here, the very concept of kingship as divine incarnation took root. The pharaoh wasn't just chosen by the gods, he was Horus on earth, a bridge between mortal and immortal realms. This theology did not permit compromise. Royal blood had to remain royal. To wed outside the palace was to blur the line between man and God. And so, the kings of the Old Kingdom began a tradition that would echo through millennia. They married their sisters. Let us look at Pharaoh Djoser, the visionary ruler behind Egypt's first pyramid. His wife, Hetepher-nebti, was almost certainly his sister. The evidence lies in titles: King's daughter and King's wife, titles often used interchangeably for queens who were also close relatives. This pattern continued with Sneferu, builder of the bent pyramid, and his son Khufu, the man behind the Great Pyramid of Giza. Khufu's queen, Meritites I, may have been his half-sister. Later generations, including Khafre and Menkaure, followed suit. Their queens bore titles like King's Daughter of His Body, implying biological paternity and marriage. These were not isolated occurrences. They were institutionalized norms, sustained across reigns, across dynasties, across centuries. In the Middle Kingdom, a period of reunification and rebirth after the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the practice remained alive. Dynasties 11 and 12 show continued patterns of incestuous marriages. Take Senusret IV, a powerful Middle Kingdom ruler. He married his sister, Neferu, and together they ruled over a revitalized Egypt. Their son, Amenemhat II, carried forward both the throne and the family blood. The priesthood supported these unions. They saw them as maintaining Ma'at, the divine balance of the cosmos. A pharaoh born from divine blood and joined to that same blood-preserved cosmic order. But nature does not bend for theology. By the late Middle Kingdom, cracks began to form. Rulers struggled with succession. Inscriptions grew vague. Burial practices declined in splendor. A slow rot had begun to creep into the line, and yet the practice endured. Why? Why would such an advanced civilization persist in a practice so dangerous? Because the danger was invisible. Genetic damage accumulates slowly, and in early generations its effects may be subtle or even masked. A generation might produce a strong ruler. The next, one with mild issues. Only over time do the recessive defects surface fully, and ancient Egyptians had no knowledge of chromosomes, alleles, or hereditary disease. But they did have mythology. And myth, in a world where the divine blueprint was incest, deviation was heresy. Even the gods' deformities were deified. The dwarf god Bes became a household protector. The limping god Ptah was a creator deity. Physical difference was not always shunned. It was incorporated into divinity itself. This may have made it harder to recognize, or reject, the early signs of genetic failure. But signs did exist. In skeletal remains from the Old and Middle Kingdom elite, we begin to see patterns. Abnormal cranial sutures, fused vertebrae, and signs of congenital scoliosis. These are not conclusive proof of inbreeding, but they are clues. And perhaps more telling than bones is silence. The more the practice endured, the more quiet the records became. Kings without sons, queens without titles, heirs who ruled briefly before vanishing into the desert. It wasn't always a physical collapse. Sometimes it was dynastic erosion. The royal lines thinned. Succession grew unstable. Usurpers arose. Civil war returned. By the end of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt again fractured, setting the stage for the chaotic Second Intermediate Period. And yet, when power was restored in the new kingdom under Ahmose I, the old habits returned, stronger than ever, wiser perhaps, but still chained to the same divine logic. The seeds of disaster were not planted in the reign of Tutankhamun. They were planted in the reign of Djoser, watered by myth, fertilized by doctrine, and harvested in tragedy. In Section 5, we shift focus to the ripple effects. How did this obsession with blood purity influence other ancient civilizations? Was Egypt unique in its divine incest, or simply the most visible victim? Egypt was not an island. It was the glittering jewel of the ancient world, and its influence spread like the flooding Nile. But what of its darkest legacy? Was Egypt alone in its obsession with sacred bloodlines, or did others follow suit? As it turns out, divine incest was contagious. While Egypt's religious rationale was uniquely theocratic, gods marrying gods, kings becoming deities, the concept of keeping royal bloodlines pure was far more widespread than we often acknowledge. Across time and continents, the urge to consolidate power through consanguineous marriage reemerged, sometimes echoing Egypt, sometimes arising independently. Let's begin in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians and Akkadians generally frowned upon incest. Their legal codes and mythologies contained punishments and warnings. Yet among the kings of Ur and Assyria, exceptions occurred. Royal marriages between cousins were common. Sister marriages were rarer but not unheard of, especially among priestly castes where divine status was invoked. Mesopotamian kings might not have claimed divine birth, but they understood the value of divine proximity and bloodline consolidation. Still, Egypt stood apart in its ritualization of incest. Where others occasionally practiced it, Egypt made it a dynastic doctrine, until the Hellenistic Greeks arrived. When Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, his general Ptolemy I seized Egypt and founded the Ptolemaic Dynasty, a Greek ruling house that consciously adopted ancient Egyptian customs to legitimize its rule. And among those customs? Brother-sister marriage. Ptolemy II married his full sister, Arsinoe II, reviving the ancient practice of divine incest for political gain. His successors followed the pattern relentlessly. By the time of Cleopatra VII, nearly 3 centuries later, the Ptolemaic line had become notoriously inbred, more so than even the original pharaohs. Cleopatra herself married 2 of her brothers during her reign, though these were political arrangements. She eventually formed unions with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony instead. What began as Egyptian religious ritual had been adopted and amplified by a foreign dynasty, not out of spiritual devotion, but imperial strategy. And the consequences? Much like their Egyptian predecessors, the later Ptolemies suffered from fragile health, erratic rule, and childlessness. Cleopatra's own son with Caesar, Caesarion, was executed at 17, ending both her dynasty and the last breath of pharaonic rule. Among the Hittites of Anatolia, royal marriage policies are less well documented, but cousin marriage and the elevation of close kin into power roles were part of the royal tradition. However, the Hittite legal code contains explicit bans on incest, a striking contrast to Egypt's normalized practices. But even so, dynastic marriages with close relatives occurred when politically expedient, often among cousins or half-siblings. In times of succession crises, royal families across the region turned inward to secure legitimacy. When the throne trembles, the bloodline tightens. Perhaps the most extreme post-Egyptian case lies in ancient Persia, particularly under the Sassanid Empire. Zoroastrian scriptures from the late antique period speak of a practice called kvetukdas, sanctioned incestuous unions between close family members, including parent-child and sibling pairings. It's debated how widespread the practice was, but it was clearly theologically permitted among elite priestly and royal classes. Some Persian rulers, like Ardashir I, are rumored to have married daughters or close kin, echoing the theological rationalization once used in Egypt. This was not accidental. The gods demanded order, and what could be more orderly than a single unbroken bloodline? The Inca and Hawaiian kings. Across oceans, the pattern persists. The instinct to preserve royal bloodlines through incest reappeared across the world, even where Egypt's influence could not reach. Among the Inca emperors of Peru, royal sibling marriage was practiced to maintain the sacred blood of the sun god. Atahualpa, the last emperor before the Spanish conquest, was born of a full sibling union. Similarly, among Hawaiian alii chiefs, sacred sibling marriage was the highest form of nobility. Only children born of such unions could claim the rank of Aupio or divine royalty. These were not Egyptian emulators. They were distant cousins in ideology. Across cultures and eras, when humans endowed power with divinity, the womb of that power was often turned inward. When kings become gods, marriage becomes ritual, and genetics becomes a footnote. Visual, montage of royal portraits, Egypt, Inca, Persia, Hawaii, slowly merging into a DNA helix that begins to fragment. The cost across civilizations. What did all these cultures pay for their obsession? Infertility, fragility, madness. Some dynasties lasted centuries, others collapsed in a generation. But the underlying theme remained the same. Power, when too tightly bound, begins to unravel from within. The ancient Egyptians may have been the first to institutionalize divine incest, but they were not the last. Their vision of a pure, sacred bloodline spread far and wide. A genetic ideology echoed in empires that would rise and fall. In Section 6, we return to Egypt one final time to examine the aftermath. What happened to the inbred dynasties? What lessons did the ancients leave behind, buried not in scrolls or statues, but in their bones? Temples crumble, dynasties die, names fade from stone, but bones remember. In the hushed tombs of the New Kingdom and beyond, the legacy of Egypt's divine bloodlines rests silently in linen and stone. But with the eyes of science, CT scans, DNA sequencing, forensic reconstruction, the past has begun to speak again, and it whispers of fragility. Let us return, one last time, to the remains of the 18th dynasty. The boy king's clubfoot, his cleft palate, the necrosis in his bones, the miscarried fetuses buried beside him, his likely daughters who never took their first breath. These are not coincidences. They are the echoes of a broken blueprint. Generations of close-kin marriage had rendered Egypt's royal line biologically unstable. But Tutankhamun is not alone. The mummies speak. In 2010, a breakthrough study led by Dr. Zahi Hawass and Dr. Karsten Pusch analyzed DNA from 11 royal mummies. Among them were Amenhotep III, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and several unidentified female mummies. What the study uncovered was extraordinary and damning. Akhenaten was indeed Tutankhamun's father. Akhenaten's sister, not Nefertiti, was the mother. Tutankhamun's children, both stillborn girls, were likely the result of similarly close inbreeding. One of the most astonishing findings? A significant number of the mummies shared identical mitochondrial DNA, passed down maternally, confirming that the royal family had been recycling the same limited genetic material for generations. The same blood, over and over, across mothers, daughters, brothers, sons. It wasn't just deformities or stillbirths. Signs of scoliosis, fused vertebrae, elongated skulls, and premature arthritis suggest these were not isolated anomalies. They were hereditary pathologies that worsened with time. Genetic collapse. Scientists now describe what happened to Egypt's royal family as a genetic bottleneck, a point at which the available gene pool becomes so restricted that every subsequent generation inherits and magnifies the same recessive flaws. And unlike in modern society, ancient Egypt had no concept of recessive disorders. They believed ailments came from curses, sin, or divine judgment, not DNA. But the truth was written in the double helix, not in the stars. As the new kingdom waned, so too did the lineages most dependent on purity. The Ramesside dynasty, while slightly more genetically diverse, still bore the stamp of incestuous thinking. Ramesses II had dozens of children, but many died young. His own wife, Nefertari, may have been his sister or cousin. By the 20th dynasty, Egypt's central power was crumbling. Tombs were looted not by foreigners, but by hungry Egyptians. Priests hid the royal mummies in secret caches to protect them, and in doing so, preserved the biological evidence that would one day expose the silent rot of empire. Legacy. A lesson buried in linen. It's easy to judge the ancients, to call their marriages unnatural or their beliefs deluded, but their choices were rooted not in ignorance, but ideology. They believed the pharaoh was divine, that divine blood should not be diluted, that family lines were sacred and closed. What they could not see was the slow, creeping price of purity. In seeking eternity through the body, they planted ruin in the womb. Modern genetics has confirmed what the ancients never suspected. Inbreeding increases the risk of numerous disorders. Skeletal deformities, infertility, lowered immunity, congenital heart disease, and cognitive impairments. And the data found in royal mummies matches these risks with chilling precision. Yet even now, their glory endures. We still gaze in awe at Karnak. We marvel at the perfection of the Great Pyramid. We flock to museums to see the golden mask of a boy king who could barely walk. We remember their beauty, but their bodies remember their curse. As modern science probes deeper into these ancient tombs, it unearths not just history, but a warning. That unchecked power, when built on blood alone, will collapse in on itself. That myth, no matter how sacred, cannot overcome biology. That the cost of believing one is a god is to inherit the frailty of mortals. In our final section, we'll draw together the strands of this story, 6,000 years of ambition, belief, glory, and genetic disaster. From Djoser to Cleopatra, from Akhenaten to Tutankhamun, Egypt's rulers built the most enduring civilization in human history. They crafted wonders from stone, invented calendars, embalmed the dead, and believed they could master time itself. But in their effort to keep power divine, they sealed their fate in blood. They married their sisters to protect legacy. They wed their daughters to preserve divinity. They looked to gods for guidance and ignored nature's laws. What began as spiritual devotion became biological devastation. Across 6 sections, we've seen this truth unfold. In Section 1, we uncovered the religious foundations of incestuous rule, the belief that royal blood was godly and marriage within the family was a sacred obligation. In Section 2, we saw its consequences in Tutankhamun, the boy king twisted by generations of inbreeding, dead before adulthood, his daughters born lifeless beside him. In Section 3, we tracked the full 18th dynasty, where power and prestige masked deformity and decline, as rulers wed ever closer relatives to secure divine legitimacy. In Section 4, we went further back to the Old Kingdom, and found that this wasn't a late-stage flaw. It was a civilizational blueprint drawn from the gods themselves. In Section 5, we saw the idea spread beyond Egypt, to Persia, Peru, and Greece, proving this was no isolated practice, but a universal temptation of empire. And in Section 6, we returned to the tombs, where modern science confirmed what ancient whispers could not, that divine bloodlines were biological minefields. The tragedy of Egypt's rulers is not merely that they died young or malformed. It's that they were prisoners of a myth so powerful it chained their wombs, their crowns, and their children's lives. Today, their faces stare back at us from museum cases. Their bones lie scanned in hospital-grade machines. Their DNA is archived, sequenced, decoded. And what does it tell us? That immortality is not built from gold or stone or royal blood. It is built from truth and the courage to question even the most sacred of beliefs. Visual, Tutankhamun's golden mask fades into black. Final words appear in silence. In the end, the gods did not die, but the kings who tried to become them did.